There is a cigarette being lit somewhere in the world right now. Actually, there are approximately 300,000 being lit every single minute. And if you ask anyone holding one why they started smoking, they will give you some version of the same answer: peer pressure, stress, boredom, a phase. Nobody says, I started because of an ancient neurological drive that has been running in the human brain for longer than our species has existed. But that is the actual answer. The desire to inhale burning things is not a modern invention. It is not a colonial habit. It is not something advertising created. It is something that was already ancient by the time the first written word was carved into stone. And the story of where it actually comes from is one of the strangest, most human, and most uncomfortable things you will learn today. Here is the question almost nobody asks about smoking. Not when did cigarettes get invented, not when did tobacco arrive in Europe, but when did the first human being look at something burning and deliberately put their face in it to inhale? That question sounds absurd until you realize that it has a real answer, and that the answer is not 300 years ago, not 2,000 years ago, but potentially as old as fire itself. And here is the thing that makes this genuinely disturbing. Your brain did not need to be taught to want this. The receptors in your brain that respond to the compounds in psychoactive smoke were there before the first human ever intentionally smoked anything. They were not created by exposure. They were already waiting, which means the very first human who inhaled smoke from a burning plant did not discover something foreign. Their brain recognized something, like running into someone you know in a city you have never visited. That feeling of impossible familiarity is the most important clue in this entire story, and understanding it changes everything about why humans smoke, why they always have, and why, despite knowing exactly what it does to them, they continue. Let's go back, not to the first cigarette, not to the first pipe, not even to the first deliberate act of smoking. Let's go back to the moment before any of that, to a fire in Africa, approximately 800,000 years ago. This is not a campfire in the cozy modern sense. There is no circle of stones, no carefully selected firewood, no one roasting anything on a stick while someone else plays guitar. This is a fire at the edge of a cave, maintained desperately, because the alternative is darkness, and darkness at this point in human prehistory is not inconvenient. It is lethal. The people around this fire are not Homo sapiens. They are an earlier ancestor, Homo erectus, with a brain roughly 2/3 the size of yours, but with enough cognitive capacity to maintain a fire, to coordinate with a group, and to notice that something about this particular night feels different because this particular fire is burning something it has not burned before, a plant that grew near the cave entrance, that fell into the flames when someone moved past it, and within minutes of that plant beginning to burn, something changes in the air, and something changes in the people breathing that air. This is not recorded history. Nobody wrote it down. But it happened. We know it happened because of what the human brain is still carrying 800,000 years later, the endocannabinoid system. Every human brain contains receptors specifically designed to interact with cannabinoids, the compounds released when cannabis burns. These receptors are called CB1 and CB2, and they are among the oldest receptor systems in the vertebrate brain. They predate our species by millions of years. They regulate mood, memory, pain response, appetite, the feeling of time slowing, the sudden conviction that the person next to you is genuinely interesting. These receptors did not evolve because humans discovered cannabis. They evolved for entirely different biological reasons. But the fact that they exist, the fact that every human brain is pre-wired to respond to this specific compound, means that the first time an ancient human breathed smoke from a burning cannabis plant, their brain did not go, "What is this?" Their brain went, "Oh, there you are." That was not addiction, that was recognition, and recognition is something an ancient human paid attention to, because in a world where most things were trying to kill you, finding something that made you feel better was information worth keeping. Here is where this story gets genuinely extraordinary, because the gap between accidental exposure and deliberate ritual is not thousands of years. In ancient human terms, it is probably dozens of generations, which sounds like a long time, but is almost nothing in evolutionary history. The first person who noticed that a specific smoke made them feel different told someone, "We know this because telling someone is what humans do." It is the single most consistent behavior in the entire archaeological record. Humans notice things, and they talk about them, and that knowledge, that specific smoke from specific plants does specific things, began to accumulate in a world without writing, without schools, without any system of formal knowledge transfer. That accumulation happened the only way it could, through careful observation passed mouth to ear around fires that burned every single night. By the time anatomically modern Homo sapiens appear in Africa approximately 300,000 years ago, this knowledge was already ancient, already refined, already categorized in the way that pre-literate minds categorize everything they find important through pattern and repetition and story. And here is the piece of evidence that most people have never heard. That suggests this knowledge was already highly sophisticated, long before any civilization wrote it down. In 2019, researchers excavating a site in the Great Basin Desert of Utah found something unexpected in a 12,000-year-old hearth: seeds from Nicotiana attenuata, a wild tobacco species native to North America, in concentrations that were not accidental, not blown in by wind, not carried there by animals, deliberately placed in the fire 12,000 years ago, with no pipe, no pottery, no written record of any kind. Someone was already putting tobacco in fire with intention. 12,000 years ago was the end of the last ice age. Every civilization you have ever studied in school, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, every single one of them comes after this by thousands of years. Whatever was happening at that Utah hearth was happening before any of it. And in the absence of pottery or pipes or any of the technology we associate with smoking, the most likely explanation is that people were gathering around that fire and breathing. Now here is where it goes from interesting to astonishing, because scattered across every continent where humans lived, before any of them had contact with each other, before any trade route connected the Americas to Asia, before any ship crossed any ocean, independently, simultaneously, in isolation, every major human civilization developed the same thing: sacred smoking rituals. The Scythians of Central Asia, a nomadic people who lived roughly 2,500 years ago, had a ritual that the ancient Greek historian Herodotus described in remarkable detail. They would build small enclosed tents, heat stones until they glowed red, place cannabis on those stones, sit inside the tent, and inhale. Herodotus wrote that they howled with pleasure. For centuries, historians assumed he was exaggerating. Then archaeologists started excavating Scythian burial mounds and found exactly what he described: bronze braziers, heated stones, cannabis residue with unusually high THC content. Herodotus was not exaggerating. He was reporting on the other side of the planet, in the Amazon basin, cultures that had never heard of the Scythians were doing something structurally identical: a shaman, a specific plant, an enclosed space, intentional inhalation, and an altered state used for a specific purpose, not recreation, not addiction, but communication. The smoke was a carrier, a vehicle that traveled between the physical world and whatever was believed to exist beyond it. In ancient India, a medical system called Ayurveda, over 3,000 years old, described a practice called Dhumapana, which translates as smoke drinking. Detailed protocols, specific plants, specific conditions, specific amounts, delivered through pipes, with documented therapeutic outcomes. This was not casual. This was a medical system with centuries of refinement, and across ancient Egypt, ancient China, ancient Mesopotamia, the same pattern repeated: smoke as medicine, smoke as ritual, smoke as technology, not for pleasure, but for purpose. The thing that connects all of these, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, is the intentionality. Nobody in any of these traditions was smoking because they were bored. They were smoking because it worked for something, and then something happened that transformed something sacred and intentional and medicinal into something else entirely. In 1492, Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean and observed indigenous Taino people doing something his crew had never seen: walking around with small bundles of dried leaves, rolled and lit at one end, inhaling the smoke through the other. His journal entry about it is almost confused. He could not explain what he was seeing. His crew figured it out within weeks. Tobacco spread through Europe with a speed that is genuinely startling. Within 50 years of that first contact, smoking was fashionable across the continent. Within 100 years, it was a global trade commodity. Within 4 centuries, the industrially manufactured cigarette arrived and everything changed. Because the cigarette did something no previous form of smoking had ever done, it made nicotine delivery faster, more efficient, more convenient, and more addictive than anything that had existed before. The tobacco industry then spent decades suppressing research showing cigarettes caused cancer, research their own scientists had conducted, research they knew about, and hid, something the ancient Ayurvedic physician prescribing medicinal herbs, and the Scythian sitting in his tent howling with pleasure, had absolutely no way of anticipating that the plant they treated with ritual care would one day be engineered specifically to be as addictive and as lethal as possible, and sold to children. The gap between those two things is one of the larger moral distances in human history. So here is where we actually are. The behavior of inhaling smoke predates civilization by an almost incomprehensible margin. It predates agriculture. It predates pottery. It predates every written language, every city, every empire. The receptors in your brain that respond to it are older than your species, the drive that underlies it, the human tendency to seek altered states, to change what the inside of the mind feels like, has been documented in every culture ever studied, on every continent, in every era. Researchers who study this call it the fourth drive. Alongside hunger, thirst, and the drive to reproduce, the desire to alter consciousness is not a cultural aberration. It is not a weakness. It is not a modern problem. It appears to be woven into the fabric of what it means to have a brain like ours. What changed is not the drive. What changed is what we did with it when something ancient and ritual and intentional gets handed to an industry whose only obligation is to make money. The outcome is predictable and has been catastrophic. The smoke itself is not the story. The story is what humans always do with fire. We use it to gather, to communicate, to connect with something beyond the ordinary, and occasionally, to burn ourselves. If this made you think about smoking differently, share it with someone who has always wondered why they started, and I will see you in the next one.